It's time to relive great moments with former Cowboys.
Eddie Sutton, one of the all-time great.
You know, that's one of the great things in having the opportunity to coach here in Oklahoma State was the fact that you had such great people.
It's time for Where Are They Now on Triple Play Sports Radio.
John Farrell, former Cowboy pitcher back in the early 80s.
And, you know, mostly putting up with me, I guess, after, chasing everybody around, chasing us around the country.
Where Are They Now? Our weekly talk with former Oklahoma State athletic coaches, players, and personnel.
Desmond Mason, former All-American player here at Oklahoma State.
So today, that's what I spend most of my days doing. For the most part is, in the studio trying to paint and trying to create, and I enjoy doing that.
It's like catching up with an old friend every Wednesday.
Boy, do I feel old today, as I always do on a Wednesday when we bring back some of these former athletes. We're talking with Houston.
Sure did. Had a great time. That was of course, my mom and dad went to school there. My brother, Dickie, as you mentioned, went to school there. And, of course, we both met our wives right there in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Now your host, ready to take a stroll down memory lane, here is Tom Dirato.
Well, thank you, and welcome once again to Where Are They Now? And as we have previewed for the last hour or so, a good friend of mine on the show today, and a fellow retiree, I would say now, John Klein. He doesn't need any introduction. If you read the Tulsa World for the better part of the last 4 decades, you know who I'm talking about. But Mr. Klein is officially retired from the newspaper business. How does it feel?
What day is this?
That's about what happens, isn't it?
A couple of Saturdays ago, I was, I woke up and then we went to, in Tulsa, they have this great little farmer's market down Cherry Street. And I remember I was like, well, when you go to the farmer's market and I all of a sudden I started realizing my Saturdays are just like every other day of the week. It's, other than the farmer's market on Cherry Street, the rest of the day is exactly like all the other days. So it's been interesting because once I got out of school at OSU and went to work like a week later in Ardmore, and then 2 years later went to work in Tulsa and had a little 5-year stop in Houston and then back to Tulsa. I've worked every day basically for a daily newspaper since 1 week out of college. So I mean, to wake up all of a sudden on a Monday early in April, my first Monday that I wasn't working, and not have to think about where am I going that week, what stories do I have to write, do I have a column ready for the next day? It was so different, but so far it's been great fun, and I keep reading about the end of Allie P. Reynolds Stadium, and I'm sure you remember this. I was there that day.
I know where you're going, yeah.
And I remember everything about it. I had written a story. In fact, they had a cover story in Collegiate Baseball Magazine, and they had a beautiful picture of Allie P., and I wrote that story for Collegiate Baseball, plus the Tulsa World, of course. And I also wrote one for Baseball America because I was also their college baseball correspondent. I was actually a hard worker back when I was like 28. So
hey, let me brag on you.
Whatever that was.
Let me brag on you. You were, and you're not going to bring this up, but I will. One of the many honors that you were able to garner. You were named the top college baseball writer for the decades of the 1990s by Collegiate Baseball. Now, we're not talking about having one good year. We're talking about having a decade of good years.
Well, but a lot of that was also, I mean, not only that, I mean, I got to cover Oklahoma State at its height in the 80s, and then moved to Houston, and I was covering Gus Ball when they made the finals a couple times and won a title. So, I mean, I got the best of both worlds. I mean, I was there. I think my first year on college baseball was 1979, and OSU won the Big Eight that year, I believe. But they did not. Maybe not. But I remember I went to the College World Series that year because Arkansas made the College World Series first time ever, and they reached the finals. And then OSU 2 years later, they go in 81, I believe, and they went to the finals. So I basically could have been paying taxes in Omaha. I was there so much.
Especially with Oklahoma State, 7 years in a row. Yeah.
Well, and think about how much, this, Tom. I mean, in those days, the College World Series was set up a little different, and the brackets were different, and the way they played it out were different. And if you got some rain dates, you literally could be there 2.5, 3 weeks, which we were a couple of times.
Yeah.
So you got to know that town pretty well. Look, I mean, hanging out with Rex and you and Coach Ward there was a lot of fun. But after about 3 weeks, it was like, okay, when am I going to get
when are we finally going to head that car south here and get on out of here? No, I agree with you.
You know, I love to tell the story in '81, and Gary was he wasn't new, but he was relatively new. And I've told this story a million times. Gary was, as you well know, one of the most thoughtful, wonderful guys ever to talk to. I mean, you ask him one question, and 20 minutes later he goes, is that all you need?
Yeah.
He was so good at explaining the game and what happened in the game to you. It didn't matter whether they won or lost. He was the same both ways. And I'll never forget, in '81, they reached the finals without a loss. And the way the College World Series was set up back then, it was really screwy. OSU had to play an extra game, which was dumb. And they kind of threw that game away and had everything going for them in the finals, and they just got outscored by, I believe, Arizona State.
That's correct. Yes.
And I'll never forget Gary up there. He was so dejected. But we're standing on top of that roof at Rosenblatt Stadium, and Gary was he was crushed. But he answered every question and hung there with us to the bitter end. And there was probably me and you and Rex and Mac Bentley, Steve O'Brien, all the guys that covered college baseball back then. And we get done with him, and we're walking down the steps. Pretty soon Gary's walking down the steps, and we get down to the parking lot at Rosenblatt, and there's like one car in the parking lot. And it's the car I've rented for Omaha. There's no bus. There's no nothing. And Gary Ward, who just coached the Cowboys to the national title game, goes, "Hey, can I get a lift back to the hotel?"
I know it, yeah. That's true.
That is true story. And yeah. Apparently the OSU team bus said, "We can't wait on the head coach anymore. Let's just go."
Well, they knew he was going to talk forever, so they didn't want to wait. I'm sure. They said, "We can't sit on the bus for an hour and a half."
I had a lot of great times covering college baseball. I just loved it so much, and because Gary was great and the teams he had were great. And look, Oral Roberts was very good back then.
Yes.
They had Larry Koshel, and they had Mike Moore, who was the #1 pick, and whatever year that was, 85, 84. They had great teams also. Oklahoma with the Enos had great teams. And, of course, Norman DeBrine over at Arkansas had great teams. So, and that's not even counting Wichita State, who had all these kids from Tulsa who were playing at Wichita. So, it was a great time to be covering college baseball. It really was.
Things change, and that's kind of what I want to get into because John is much younger than I am. But we did cover a lot of things together back in the day. And
yes, we did.
I just wondered what your thoughts are right now. And it's going to sound like two old guys sitting on a park bench, complaining about the way the world is today. But did you ever foresee the demise? Might be just a little bit strong, but the downturn of the printed media as we've seen it over the last, 4 or 5 years, maybe back when we first started, because that was it, man. That was the thing to do. Pick up that paper, read something.
Well, no. I would have never envisioned that. I would have thought, you know what, people are always going to need a newspaper. But how did I know that you were going to have a phone that would give you all kinds of information, including access to newspaper stories?
Mm-hmm.
You just could not have predicted. I mean, I've got one of those new iPhones I got as I was going out the door to the world, and I'm telling you, it does stuff. It's remarkable. And I would have never guessed that newspapers would go out of business, but I also would have never guessed that you could get all kinds of information and take pictures with your phone that you were going to carry in your pocket. So, no, I never figured it was going to be that way. But honestly, the last 4 or 5 years, it has been trending downward for a while now. And, it's just the way of the world, and I get it. I love being able to sit at my kitchen table with my wife, and we'll get up and we get like 2 or 3 newspapers every day. And so every day I'm looking at my local paper, the Tulsa World. I'm looking at a national paper, and I love, holding it in my hands and reading it. I know I can read it on my phone. I've got the apps for both the Tulsa World, New York Times, a whole bunch of stuff, but I like holding it in my hands, and I like reading it that way. And that's probably because I'm 65 years old.
Yeah.
But I still like that. Unfortunately, most people have shifted away from it, and I get it. I used to wake up. I live right in the middle of Tulsa, have over 30 years. I live in an area called Ranch Acres, and this is an old traditional neighborhood in Tulsa. They've had a garden club here for 70 years. I mean, it's a cool place, and the people here, most of them over the course of time, have, a lot of kids now have bought their parents' houses or inherited them, and they now live in this neighborhood. But I've always been able to walk outside in the morning, and all up and down my street, everyone's got a newspaper or 2 in their driveway. Mm-hmm. And now there's about 2. And I talked to one of my neighbors the other day who came over to tell me personally that he was giving up his subscription to the Tulsa World for all these years. And I asked him why, and he told, the price. I get it, folks. I mean, the price of the Tulsa World has gone from $26 a month to $45 a month for the printed product. I get it.
I still pay for it. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I get it. I'm not an idiot. I understand. Number one, you can get it on your phone for a whole lot cheaper, and number 2, it's expensive now. And the product. I mean, I was a sports editor for a long time at the World, and we never had less than 24-page sports sections for forever. And now the Monday newspaper, the entire damn newspaper is 20 pages.
Yeah, I know.
So, I get it, and I understand. I'm saddened by it because I think, having a vibrant, media is so important for everyone. I mean, people, I said, I don't care what your politics are. I said, are you interested in what's happening at City Hall? Are you interested in what's happening at the state capitol in Oklahoma City? Because that's what you're getting in our newspaper or the Daily Oklahoma. And that's stuff you really can't get anywhere else. And, I think it's important, but I totally understand. And look, Tom, when you and I were involved in the media in sports, if I went to an Oklahoma State, let's say I was doing Oklahoma State that week in football, I would come over on Monday and do the press conference with Coach Jones or Jimmy or whoever it was at the time, and then I would get a player later on that afternoon, and then I'd pick up some stuff for the advance, and then I was pretty much done for the week.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And the only people there on Mondays were usually you and me and someone from the Daily Oklahoman, usually Ron Holt from the Stillwater News Press, uh-huh. And maybe one other guy or 2, TV people. Now, how many websites cover OSU?
At least 3, 4, 5, probably. Yeah.
And so you've got all those people showing up every day to talk to players and coaches after practice. You have all the newspapers still, all the TV stations. You've got these video bloggers that are involved. I guess I kind of understand where the coaches are coming from. They can't have 20 people standing out there with their iPhones filming practice every day. Mm-hmm. I get that. I totally agree with Coach Gundy or whoever. I hate it. I mean, I joke with Pat Jones when I see him. Pat lives over here, of course. And I'll joke with Pat Jones about the time that Pat was like, I don't even know why I did it, but after I went out there on a Monday afternoon, they're having practice. You know, I just walked into the stadium and sat down, and he comes up and sits down. And Pat says, "Why are you here?" I said, "Well, no, I didn't have anything better to do, and I'm going to hang around, go have a few beers with Butch Davis or somebody later on, and or Tony Wise and those guys." And he goes, "Well, you don't need to be out here." He says, "If anything big happens, I'll call you."
Yeah.
This is a head coach, so I like to laugh about that because no one went to. Did you? I mean, you might go to practice occasionally, but how often did you go to practice back in the day? Now, if they open up practice, I promise you, they've got a half dozen people there every day, don't they?
Well, they would, but you know what? The two things that come out of this, number one, yes, but I worked for the university, so for many of those years, so I went out to practice every day just because. But
right.
Long story short, the trust factor was better then, and I understand why it's not now, because you got a lot of some of these new people who have no idea about what trust is about, and will put anything out that they think is big just to make them look good. But there's not a two-way trust factor like there used to be with coaches and media. And the other side is, too, you can do or say something, but if it's on a phone just for 10 seconds, that's what people see. That's the perception. And they make their own judgment on, what did he say? How did he act? How did he look? What was he doing?
Right.
And I understand where the coaches come from. I wouldn't put up with it either.
No, see, and that's it. Is I totally understand it. I yes, but I love it if they let every media guy go to everything. Okay, great. But number one, I know why they're doing it because I agree with you. They would take something. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of people in my business who aren't cut from the same cloth I was in
Correct.
1972. You know, it's a whole different world now. And people always say, "Isn't it awful?" I always say, well, it's just different. And it's so different for Coach Gundy as opposed to Pat Jones or Jimmy Johnson or anybody else. I mean, I hear people talk about Coach Switzer a lot and comparing him to Bob Stoops. I go, those guys lived in a different world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jimmy and Pat and Barry used to throw parties for the media after the games.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. That's so unbelievable now. But you and I both know that is what happened. I remember going to a lot of Pat Quinn parties.
Yes, sir. Right after every home game, for sure.
Yep. Johnny Keefe down in Norman. And, it was completely different. And I'm not saying it's better or worse or whatever. It's different. And, I think I always had a good relationship with, I think that was my best attribute. I never thought I was a great writer, and I never thought I was a great reporter, but I was really good at relationships. And I was able to sit down with coaches and get a good idea of where they're coming from. And look, they would tell me stuff that they probably shouldn't be telling me.
Sure, but they knew you weren't going to write it, though.
They knew that I wouldn't write it.
Yeah.
And you're right. And I had very few conflicts with coaches. I mean, over the years, very few. I mean, occasionally toward the end of my time in sports, we had coach things pop up that required me to say something nasty about this guy or that guy about something or other. Well, John Blake, I remember having to write this column, and it was hard for me because I've known John since he was in high school, like John Blake's family. I think they're wonderful people. Butch Davis, in fact, was John Blake's junior high football coach. I didn't know if you knew that.
Mm-hmm.
But, I mean, there was all these connections, and yet I was writing this column saying John Blake needs to be fired. And so I called John Blake and said, I'm calling you in advance to tell you this. And we had this, deep, long conversation. But I didn't think it was fair for me to just, print it in the paper and then the next day just go hide and not answer the phone.
Right.
I felt like it was my responsibility as a journalist, as one that was trained in the 60s and 70s, that if I'm going to say something bad about a person, I'm by God going to go let them, go face to face or give them a call and say, this is what I'm doing. Tell me why I shouldn't. And I don't know, that's probably something that doesn't happen very often anymore. Now it's you get them in a press conference setting and you ask them some questions and they are nasty to you, and then it just derails from that point. But I never had any big problems. I got along with just about everybody, but, the sports I covered, primarily wrestling, which, how could you not like Tommy Chesbro and John Smith and the people I've dealt with in that sport, and then, college baseball with Gary, who was such a good guy, and Norm DeBrine. Hell, I loved Enos. I liked Larry. I thought, the coach at Wichita, Gene,
yeah, Stevenson was coming on board then, yeah.
Yeah, Gene was. Gene didn't get along with anybody, but he was highly entertaining.
Yes, he was.
So, and of course, I had an in with him because my high school teammate Brent Kimnitz over in Perry.
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
was the pitching coach. So,
hey, I'm going to change gears. I'm going to change gears because I want to get this story in here. Yeah, we're going to get back to sports and what you did in the football, basketball, auto racing. You were big into that, boxing, golf. You've covered just about everything.
I used to see your brother at auto races all the time.
I know it, and he still can't stay away from it either, even though he's not in the business anymore. But I want to get into when you went on the news side and you had to cover some major events. You covered the Oklahoma City bombing aftermath. You did that. But tell me this story. Kind of fill me in on a plane trip that you and Governor David Walters took on some ground fire, if you will.
I can't believe you remember that, but yeah, it was I did go to news. I went this last time I went to news about 2-3 years ago. Jay Cronley had died, and so
yes.
And the other columnist was leaving the paper to go back into the editorial department, so they asked me to come over and be the news columnist, which I loved, and I really appreciated doing it. I had been to Ames, Iowa quite enough at that point. But,
yeah.
Yes, we did this. The Oklahoma National Guard, Air National Guard, were doing these relief supplies, and they would fly these big, whatever they are, C-140s or whatever, over Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war, and then they would drop these relief supplies to the villages and different stuff. And I remember we're flying over there. It was beautiful, by the way. We left out of Frankfurt, middle of the night, and we flew across Venice and the Adriatic, and I remember them saying that split Croatia. We're going over, and just a gorgeous trip. And then we get over this mountainous region, and we're flying really, I thought, kind of low. The mountains didn't look that much below us. And all of a sudden I see these flashes of light. So I'm sitting in the second seat behind the pilots and stuff, and I said, so what are those flashes down there? And they said, that's anti-aircraft. I said, well, hold on. Someone's shooting at us, and the guy was like, don't worry about it. They can't reach us. I go, hold on. Say this again. Someone is actually shooting at us. So, I was like, okay, that's probably not my favorite thing I've done in my lifetime, but it was a good experience. I loved I did another National Guard trip, which was kind of cool. We went into Panama right after Noriega because the Oklahoma National Guard was also involved in that particular thing. And so we did that. And, there was all kinds. When I got to news this last time, I had some really interesting things. Like I met a guy that was working on my wife's shirt, and I found out he was a Holocaust survivor.
Wow.
And I wrote this story about how the fact that he could sew buttons onto uniforms that saved his life because they needed people to repair the German soldiers' uniforms. So he spent all this time doing that. And all kinds of really interesting stories that I think are fascinating. And And since no one in Oklahoma really had someone that still went out and kind of covered the state, like the Oklahoman had been cut back so much at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go to Woolaroc and write about Woolaroc. Or I would go up, like the Price Tower in Bartlesville is such a magnificent place. It's the tallest, biggest Frank Lloyd Wright building ever built. It's a fantastic place. You can stay there. They have a great restaurant. I love the Tallgrass Prairie. I've been up there a couple of times to do stories where we would stay in the bunkhouse, and it's pretty hard to top waking up in the morning with a cup of coffee, walking out and standing on top of a hill on the Tallgrass Prairie, and all you can see is buffalo and the sunrise. That's a pretty great thing.
Yeah.
And I love that kind of stuff. And, you know, Ree's got the great Mercantile now in Pawhuska, the Crystal Bridges I've written about over in Bentonville a bunch. There, you know, Oklahoma's an interesting place. I mean, it really is. It's got a lot of interesting things here. A few years ago, I went over to do the story with Bob LaFortune, who is a big board member of Philmont Scout Ranch, famous place in New Mexico, which was funded by the Phillips family here in Tulsa and Bartlesville. And the Phil Tower in Tulsa, that funded Philmont for, I don't know, 50, 60 years. And they found the Boy Scouts finally sold it. But I went to the Phil Tower, and Brainerd Chemical, a company here in town, I think the guy's name is Matt Brainerd, they invited me up to see Frank Phillips' original office up there, or Wade Phillips. And it was fascinating. I mean, the guy had gone to Italy and got the same tiles and completely redid his office to look exactly like it did when the Phil Tower was built. It was a very cool thing. And I love sports. I mean, I grew up doing it in Perry and loving it and thought it was great fun. And from the time I was 15, I wanted to be a sports writer.
And you were at the Perry Daily Journal.
And I was. I used to write stories about football games and baseball games that I was playing in. I know it's hard to believe, but you'd be amazed how often an offensive and defensive tackle was the hero in the game. I mean, it was,
no, I wouldn't be. Not with your byline.
or a 280 hitter, a catcher. You know, boy, I had a lot of game-winning hits for a guy that hit about 250 or whatever the hell it was. So.
Hey, listen, before we cut you loose, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't connect the dots here. And obviously from Perry, the great wrestling tradition. Did you wrestle there, number one? But you probably were hired initially because you were of wrestling expertise at the World. There wasn't much going on at that time. So answer those questions. Did you wrestle at Perry, and was this a natural attraction for you?
Number one, I did wrestle at Perry, but not in high school. By the time I got to high school, I realized that I sucked so bad. and in fact, the wrestling coach, who was doubled as the assistant football coach, said, you're a way better football player and baseball player than a wrestler, and you're only going to get hurt if you wrestle because you suck. So I stuck, once I got to be a sophomore, I wrestled probably, 5 or 6 years, and I did love it. And I probably could have stuck it out and been average. But, I mean, in Perry, you got to be state champion quality, or hell, you can't even make the team. So, no, I never wrestled in high school. But I do have a great love of it. In my class at Perry High School was Danny Hodge Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And Danny Hodge was such a nice man. I mean, he really was. I mean, it still is. I mean, but we didn't live too far from them. And I can remember going over to his house, and he would have us kids come over, and he had these tires tied to a tree, and he would swing that as exercise. He would swing us all on these tire swings on trees and stuff at his house. I mean, just a really nice guy. And, of course, they have an unbelievable history and tradition of wrestling over there. But Ron Holt used to always laugh, because every time I'd mention, he'd say, "Oh, there's John Klein from nearby wrestling hotbed Perry." Because I once used that, because when I was in college at OSU, Steve Randall was on the OSU wrestling team. He was a very two-time national finalist. But every time I would mention Steve Randall in a Daily Oak Legion story, I'd always use the words from nearby wrestling hotbed Perry. So Ron Holt and Pat Quinn, then they kept saying, "Oh, there's John Klein from nearby wrestling hotbed Perry."
It's still apropos right there. I think I've seen your sign out there. Welcome to Perry, home of
right,
John Klein and anybody else that they want to put on there. Last thing, though, and we do miss you already. I know I do. I miss the stuff you write. But as you ease into retirement, which I can tell you I've done that initially, you think you'll get back into occasional writing for somebody, or maybe you are for that matter. I'm not going to go the book route because people hound me about writing a book, and I tell them I'm too damn lazy to write one, so I'm not going to do that. But what about yourself?
I can see me doing some of that stuff. The deal is I've already had a guy contact me about a deal, and I said, let me just not do anything till about August. How's that? And let's talk again in August. I just, it is so, I found it so refreshing to wake up, and the only thing on my schedule that day is going over to Hillcrest to the health center and riding the exercise bike for like 30 minutes. That's pretty much my day. And
That's
then
good.
I usually go to lunch with, like today I went to lunch with some guys. I've been to lunch at Southern Hills like twice.
That isn't a bad deal.
I've got all these buddies that, that keep saying, hey, let's go to lunch. I've got John Phillips, the former OSU and, the head coach at TU, longtime basketball coach over here. He and J.V. Haney, another legendary old coach. We go to the Indian Casino down at Margaritaville to do the senior citizens buffet, which turns out to be like $5.44 or something.
Ain't nothing wrong with that now, I'm telling you.
So, we do, I'm going out with buddies. I get a couple of buddies that I call the former mayors because they're all former mayors of Jinx. And, there's like these little groups of people that I go to lunch with 3 or 4 times. So 3 or 4 times a week, I usually have a lunchtime gathering. I had one of those today at a new restaurant here in Tulsa called Jam, which is excellent at 61st and Yale. It's a breakfast and lunch place that Mahogany Steakhouse opened. So, I'm finding stuff to do. My wife and I are busy. We just got back from St. Louis for a week. She was from St. Louis, and so we went up there for a week to do some stuff. And we're going on a really long trip to Europe this summer. We're going to Italy and Croatia and Slovenia, Montenegro, Malta, all these places, and end up in Rome. And so, there's certain things I, kind of want to do. And, come mid-August when Coach Gundy blows the whistle and everyone's out there sweating and, waiting to hear what they say after practice about the quarterback situation, I'll be in my air conditioning. And if you want to give me a call and say, John, according to Stillwater Radio tonight, I'm good with that. But I know you understand this because you've been through it. There comes a point, if you've been in that business for a long time, where you just don't want to have to worry about doing a report that night or writing a story that night or knowing that game starts at 8 o'clock and they need my column done by 11:15, which means I'm going to have about 10 minutes at the end of that game to get that column written. So it's nice to not have to worry about that stuff, but yes, I do miss it. And I have a buddy who called me just a day or two ago and said, you know what, they're getting ready to close down Alley P. And I said, tell me the dates they got left there. I got to get to a game there since I was at the first game at Alley P and wrote a couple of big stories about it when it opened. I want to be there. So I'll probably come over for the Baylor series.
Well, I hope so. And you let me know when you're coming over. We'll get together for sure. But I do appreciate it. We wasted a lot of your time, but I like reminiscing.
You didn't waste any of my time. I love talking to you, and I love talking to all my friends. And that you know, I grew up in Perry, and I spent 4 fabulous years in Stillwater, and then I spent another 40 years coming to Stillwater to cover games, either from Houston or Tulsa. And I've loved it, and the people have always been great to me, and I'm either related or know half the city of Stillwater, so you know that.
I know that.
I got friends in that town, by gosh.
And you got friends in high places, not low places like somebody else. Hey, John, thank you so much for being with us. And we only got about half a.
To you. Tell your brother Chris hello for
I
me.
will do it. I got your number. I'll let him text you, and he might Facebook you, all that stuff, all that fancy stuff.
I love it. Talk to you later.
All right, buddy. Thank you. That's John Klein. Just a good guy, an Oklahoma State guy, a guy I've known forever, and was a hell of a writer. This guy, I didn't want to embarrass him, but I'm just telling you, when you're named to the Journalism Hall of Fame in the state of Oklahoma, you're the Sports Writer of the Year, he has so many honors. We could have gone the whole half hour and just gone over the honors that he put together. But just a good guy, and I'm glad to hear that he'll be over here on for the Baylor series, so we'll get a chance to see and reminisce a little bit more. And he's a good summertime guest. I can see that coming up right now. We didn't even get to half the topics that I wanted to get to.